Actually, it's pretty nice out.
There you go. That's
Okay.
live now.
Wonder if the Wi-Fi does well with the fire pit.
Okay, I'm on. See you later. We've got 4 people watching right now. I should show it somewhere there. Oh, right there.
Okay.
7 now. Hey guys, I see I already have a couple people on. Do me a favor in the comment section, if you wouldn't mind, type in there, tell me who you are. And again, today, keep all the questions going as much as humanly possible. I want this to be more about you than it is about me. Coming at you from the back porch in the underground AP compound because, well, we don't have snow out here, so I might as well, right? So we'll be doing review tonight for APUS History, Period 7, 1890 to 1945. We're going to run a variety of topics from American imperialism to the Progressive Era to World War I to the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression and New Deal, foreign policy between the 2 world wars and World War II itself. I'm also more than happy to take any questions about other time periods. Some of you hopefully may have checked out the College Board review session that they offered for period 8. We will be doing a little bit of that Cold War type of stuff to get ready for the regents.
Also, Dad mentioned like when they come in to text like who they are because it doesn't say who is watching.
And again, when you comment, please just give me your name or even your last name if I'm teaching you, just so I can know who's watching and I can, kind of set that up. All right. So again, we are talking about APUS history. We are talking about period 7. And we have some key themes that we want to think of. We're talking about American imperialism. So one of the big topics that for contextualization that you'll need to know in this time period is the role that the United States played in the world. We will be talking tonight about economic policy, how America's role of the government in the economy changed. We will certainly see a very business-friendly, if not business-driven government in the age of imperialism, a government that gets a lot more hands-on in the Progressive Era, and then kind of like a turn back the clock to the laissez-faire days, 1920s, a lot more similar to the Gilded Age. And then certainly with the Depression and the New Deal and World War II, we'll see a government getting very hands-on and very involved in the economy. So we're about 1 minute away from starting. Again, if you would, please just type your name in the comments so I can see who's on. Okay. Got a couple people on there. And again, I have a set kind of deal that I'm going to do, but I would really rather this be about you. This is the shtick that I give every year when we do our nighttime review classes that, you're the customer. I want you to be happy. So it's a matter of you guys asking questions. All right, it's starting. Okay, so again, hey, we're back. We're here from the back porch of the AP compound, coming to you from, well, not quite so sunny, but still scenic Lincourt, New York. And tonight I've been kicked outside of the backyard, which I don't mind because I don't know about you guys. I've had some cabin fever. Just a couple heads up. I am working on a period 7 study guide for you guys. I will do one study guide for each period. Now, just to warn you, they look monstrous. They are not going to be assignments. It's not going to be, hey, guys, you have to do blah, 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 blah. They are for you to use as a resource to study, and they're big because I'm putting links. I'm putting primary sources for you on there. I am not going to grade you on it, but what I want to do is I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. How can I possibly do the shtick that I normally do at night every spring to get ready for the AP test, sitting here from my back porch? So when you get it, don't take a big old gulp and go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? When's it due? It's not due. It's for you. It's my present to you. I tried to make it as interactive as I could. I will make a copy of it and put it up there for you. And please feel free to copy it yourself if you want to make adjustments to it. It's for you guys. Again, you're my customers. All right. So again, we're talking about APUS history period 7, 1890 to 1945. Why 1890? Because it's still in the high point of the Gilded Age, America's age of big business, when big business dominated America, American foreign policy, the American government. The 1890s will be a decade that starts off with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we've talked about in previous classes, with the McKinley tariff, an incredibly high tariff to protect American industries, which, believe it or not, will have an influence on American imperialism. You see, a tariff gets paid by those people who live in, as John Green would say, not America. So if you're in not America, you have to pay those rates. Now, if you're an American businessman living overseas, that means it's in your best interest to somehow get into America. In the 1890s, one of the most prominent political figures was William McKinley, president from 1897 until his assassination in 1901. But beyond the presidential scope, we've got another really powerful person in the imperialist debate, and that's Teddy Roosevelt. So again, let's kind of pull back here, big picture stuff. When we talk about period 7, themes, this is the most foreign policy intensive period in the course, other than period 8, which is the Cold War, which, as you know, is not going to be on the AP test in 2020 this year. We see America's foreign policy role with the rest of the world change. It is the definition of continuity and change over time. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, we see imperialism. We see the Spanish-American War. We see the annexation of territories like Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Then we go into the Roosevelt administration with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, this idea of intervention. We're going to get involved in Latin American affairs, or as we like to call it, the big stick policy or big stick diplomacy, followed up by William Howard Taft with what's called dollar diplomacy. We're going to use American money and business interests to try to influence countries. Woodrow Wilson, who used what was called moral diplomacy, the idea that Wilson would get involved if he thought we were on some kind of moral crusade. And of course, the ultimate one being was April 2nd, 1917, when Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and said, quote, "The world must be made safe for democracy." But then we see a big change. At the end of World War I, the U.S. Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. We refuse to join the League of Nations. You had people in the Senate called the reservationists and people called the irreconcilables. What was their big objection? Well, it was Article 10, or you'll see it as a Roman numeral, Article X in the League of Nations Charter. And the big concern was that somehow this was going to get us involved in future wars. So afterward, we end up with isolation. America pulls back in. We don't want to get involved in foreign affairs. We felt burned by World War I. Some Americans felt like we got sucked into a war that we had no business being in. Couple that with the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and people were disillusioned, disenchanted. In the 1920s, when we talk about foreign policy, we go to that Warren Harding idea of a return to normalcy. According to Harding, normal America didn't get involved in foreign affairs. So we do see us kind of pull back and try to avoid future wars. Harding touts as one of his big accomplishments the Washington Naval Conference of 1921, which set ratios for how many battleships different nations could have. For every 5 the U.S. and Great Britain had, another country could have 3, another country have 1.67. The problem was agreements like this really weren't worth the paper that they were written on. They had loopholes in them. For example, there were no limits on smaller warships. Okay. The other thing that it did was Japan got a concession out of Great Britain and the United States. Those two nations agreed to stop building up, to stop fortifying their colonies, their territories in the Far East. Think the Philippines. So for Japan, that's a win. Now, the other thing is, remember, how are you going to enforce this? The League of Nations is there, but it's weak. We're not involved in it, so they have no way to really enforce this. And later on, people are going to end up, people, I should say Japan and Germany, they're going to violate it, and the League is not going to be powerless. All right. Also in the 1920s, I'll piggyback this onto foreign policy with this idea of nativism. Again, Americans got this phobia, this xenophobia of anything whether it's a person from another country or another nation's policies. We didn't want anything to do with it. In 1928, when we get to Calvin Coolidge, we see another example of isolationism, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Whole bunch of countries signed it. There's a whole bunch of treaties there. And what it effectively did was outlaw war as a foreign policy tool. But how do you enforce that? Again, the League of Nations is weak. So America really has turned inward. They've gone from being very involved in the McKinley and Teddy administrations to now not being involved and being very isolated. What's the effect of that? Well, in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and we passed in the early 30s what was called the Stimson Doctrine, which basically said we would not recognize any territorial boundary changes caused by war. Ooh. The League of Nations condemned Japan's aggression. They wagged their finger, and Japan wagged a different finger and said, you know what? We're leaving the League of Nations. What are you going to do? Now, in the early 1930s, 1933, 1934, there was a big series of Senate hearings led by a senator named Nye, N-Y-E. The Nye committee hearings investigated why we got involved in World War I, and they came to a couple conclusions. One, they felt that Woodrow Wilson had provoked a war with Germany. Two, they said that we were kind of sucked into this war by American banking and business interests who had a lot of loans tied up with our allies, and that the arms manufacturers were benefiting from this, and that they were a reason why we got involved. This made Americans more paranoid, turn inward even more. So we see a change here. Again, in this time period, we start off isolated, we get even more isolated. Congress passes a series of laws in the 1930s with the idea of, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And we call those the Neutrality Acts of 1934, 35, and 36. And the Neutrality Acts were designed to, let's go back in time, go back to this idea of George Washington with his 1790s proclamation of neutrality to keep us out of foreign wars. The Neutrality Act said that if two nations were at war, we could not sell weapons to either nation. Doesn't matter who started it. We could not give loans or credit to either nation. And Americans could not travel on the ships owned by these different nations. Okay? In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt then began to very gradually try to get America to move towards getting involved. In 1937 or 38, forgive me, I'm old, he gave his famous quarantine speech where he kind of set out what I call like a trial balloon, the idea that, fascism is like a disease. Dictatorship is like a disease. We might have to quarantine it. And it didn't go over too well with the American people. They thought, geez, FDR, you're trying to get us involved in a war. And FDR kind of backed off and said, whoa. Hey, listen, I was just saying. Then events began to speed up in a very rapid fashion. Also in the 1930s, there was a ship that we had called the Panay. It was a gunboat. The Japanese attacked it while it was in the Yangtze River of China, which was considered international waters. The Panay was guarding Standard Oil tankers. Yes, they were messing with Rockefeller. Well, at least the Rockefeller family. And the United States, when these ships got attacked, did nothing. Japan kind of offered a token apology, but to the Japanese, that was, okay, we can do a lot with you guys. You're not going to push back. So now, fast forward through the 1920s. In 1938, Hitler moves on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, and we get what's called the Anschluss, or the annexation of Czechoslovakia. And that's where we get the Munich Pact. The United States, France, Great Britain, they meet with Germany, and they basically say, okay, look, you took that. No more now, right? Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, had the famous line, we have achieved peace in our time. The truth was, we had appeasement. And you guys learn in global studies, appeasing a bully doesn't work. Now, if you want to do a little bit of synthesis to outside this time period, one of the architects of the Munich Pact was Joseph Kennedy, JFK's dad. When JFK ran for president in 1960, that became an issue in the campaign that haunted him. Hey, are you going to be tough against the Soviets because your dad wasn't tough against the Nazis? In 1939, all of a sudden, things get scary. We had counted on the Soviet Union to be a check against Germany. And when Stalin and Hitler signed the non-aggression pact, and then September 1st, 1939, move against Poland to divide it up, all of a sudden things get more urgent. And we start to see a change, a modification in this policy of neutrality. In 1939, a new Neutrality Act was passed, and it said we could sell weapons, provide aid to our allies on what was called a cash and carry basis. They got to come get it. We're not going to ship it, and they will have to pay cash, no credit. So we're still neutral, but you see us moving. In 1940, Congress passes a new Selective Service Act. We have a peacetime draft. You can see we are clearly mobilizing, getting ready for this war. Also in this time period, FDR gives his famous Four Freedom speech, where he says everyone in America is entitled, or everyone in the world, I'm sorry, is entitled to four basic human freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom for speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, freedom from want. So now he's trying to frame the war in humanitarian terms. He meets with Winston Churchill in 1941 on a ship off the coast of Canada, and they agree on what now we call the Atlantic Charter, kind of plans for the post-war world. On top of that, in 1941, Congress passed what we now call the Lend-Lease Act. We're providing more and more aid to the Allies. And FDR gives one of those fireside chats. And again, FDR is very good at framing things in terms that are very easy for people to understand. And what he says basically is, look, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you should lend them your garden hose, because that fire could spread to your house next. And then, of course, Japan continued to be aggressive, take more territory. The United States put an embargo on scrap and other types of metal going to Japan. They created an oil embargo. And remember from ninth grade, Japan lacks natural resources. So the idea was to try to stop Japanese aggression, but to the Japanese, that kind of accelerated their plans and made them say, look, we have to launch an attack. And that attack was December 7th, 1941 at Pearl Harbor. So next day, we declare war against Japan. Germany declares war against us. Now, if you look at that time period, we see changes. We go from isolation right after this Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations was rejected into this idea of neutrality, a modified neutrality. Hey, we're not involved, but we can kind of get involved, to warfare. But we also see continuities throughout that time period from 1920 to 1941. And guys, I want to drill this one because, you got a 45-minute AP test. My guess is going to be whatever they ask you, whether it's multiple SAQs or, one long essay, is they're going to do something where you're asked to kind of like think across time periods. So think about this. Throughout that time period, guys, you have people who are opposing American involvement in foreign affairs. You have the creation of America First, the anti-World War II organization. Charles Lindbergh, who had been one of the heroes of the 1920s, was one of their leading spokespeople. You have the old FDR critic, Father Charles Coughlin, the Canadian radio priest, who really spouts off some serious anti-Semitic views. And in general, you have, like the Nye Committee, you have people who are reluctant to get involved in another war. Go back to when the League of Nations Charter and the Treaty of Versailles were rejected by the U.S. Senate. That Article 10, that idea that if you have involvement in the League of Nations, we're going to get sucked into future wars. Now, close this time period out. In 1945, a conference is held in San Francisco, and we get the creation of the United Nations. The United Nations has a peacekeeping committee. The United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, France, and China are the 5 permanent members. And one of the things about the United Nations is they have the ability to send troops. So we've gone full circle from, oh, heck no way, to, the UN is located in New York City. Okay? That's a great example of continuity and change. Now, other continuities you can point to. We're going to go fight a war against racism and discrimination. Yet, this is still a time period when you see massive discrimination in the United States against African Americans. We still have Jim Crow laws on the books. Segregation. African Americans doing the double V sign because they're hoping for victory in the war, but also victory for civil rights at home. We see discrimination against Japanese Americans with Korematsu versus the U.S. Executive Order 9066, which called for the internment of Japanese Americans. Those are continuities as well. Okay. Now, that's the foreign policy angle. We go from isolated to towards the end of the war, we have these post-war conferences at Yalta, at Potsdam, the quote big three, and it's FDR or Harry Truman as a part of that big three. So we go from, we want to be totally non-involved to we're world leaders. All right, other major themes. The changing, oh my goodness gracious, changing role of the government in the United States economy. Guys, we start in 1890, again, Gilded Age. This is when we think laissez-faire, but you're not going to say it's just basic laissez-faire. You're going to tell those AP people that it really wasn't, because remember, in the 1890s, the government was incredibly pro-business. They put their hands on a lot. High tariffs like the McKinley tariff. Very wide open immigration policies to provide cheap workers. But also, the Spanish-American War you can point to as having a lot of connection to business interests. The war starts in Cuba because the Cuban people were trying to rebel, get Spain out, become independent. There were a lot of American businesses, especially sugar companies, in Cuba. And it was in the interest of the United States to at least protect those businesses. They could have tried to invoke the Monroe Doctrine. That certainly was a factor. Again, there's your synthesis connection to way back. The basis for American imperialism, guys, was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. Europe, stay out of the West, don't interfere. Don't start new territories. Don't take back the ones you lost. Now it's the basis for we're going to get involved. Okay? Other causes. In your study guide, take a look at reasons for imperialism. We need new markets and new raw materials. Americans who wanted to spread American ideals like capitalism, democracy, Christianity, social Darwinism. This idea of, quote, the white man's burden. But that's not going to move McKinley. Go back to the Delome letter when the Spanish ambassador insults the United States. That doesn't move McKinley. The yellow journalists like Hearst and Pulitzer exaggerating stories of Spanish atrocities, and certainly the Spanish did do some horrible stuff. Their top military commander in Cuba was a guy nicknamed the Butcher. The big event, though, that provokes this war, at least for the United States, at least for McKinley, is the sinking of the USS Maine. 266 sailors die. The Yellow Press blames the Spanish. Again, Hearst and Pulitzer, and we go to war. But also don't forget the importance of guys who practice what we call jingoism. People who want to use war as a tool for nationalism. Guys like Teddy Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. Regardless, the war itself is, kind of an afterthought. They actually call it the Splendid Little War. We do get a cool war hero, my man Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. That's really what launches Roosevelt's career. He'll come out and become governor of New York, vice president, and then president. But the United States now has acquired an overseas empire. We annex the Philippines. We take Puerto Rico, Guam. Now, Cuba's a little different. It's a little bit funky. At the outset of the war, Congress passed what was called the Teller Amendment, which was added on to a war spending bill and said Cuba cannot become a U.S. territory. So, what do? This was in class when I did the whole hello puppet. Do you remember that thing? In the early 1900s, we passed the Platt Amendment, which said Cuba could not have a foreign debt to protect its independence. Cuba could not sign treaties with other countries or agreements with other countries without our approval to protect its independence. Hey, Cuba, you're going to lease us a naval base at Guantanamo Bay so we can protect your independence. Okay? So now that launches an American overseas empire, but it also brings up some moral problems. We're the country with the Declaration of Independence. Now we're sticking flags in faraway places like the Philippines who don't necessarily want us around. The Filipino people, they try to rebel against us, just like they had against the Spanish. They're led by a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. They use guerrilla warfare. We respond with camps of our own. And this debate over, what our new role in the world is leads to the creation of an organization called the Anti-Imperialist League. people who oppose this idea of America creating an overseas empire. People who are pretty important. Mark Twain, William Jennings Bryan, Jane Addams from Hull House. They're in the Anti-Imperialist League. Now you can do your little synthesis connection. That Anti-Imperialist League against the Spanish-American War, against imperialism, kick it way back to the transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau during the Mexican War. Kick it way forward. Remember Thanksgiving, that song I played by Arlo Guthrie? Alice's Restaurant, the protest song against the draft during the Vietnam War. Thank you, Eric Callahan. I decided, yeah, it's time to go back to evil Mr. Ash ways and rock the goatee again. Okay? But guys, I don't know what this test is going to be, but until they tell us otherwise, I'm thinking we've got to wow them with do it, connect it. Do it, connect it. Connect it to Jeanette Rankin, first woman in Congress. She voted against declaring war for World War I and World War II. Connect it to America First, although their motives might be different. Still, this idea of this reluctance to get involved in a war, a continuity we see throughout. Okay? Now, we talked about foreign policy, role of business. That's kind of what we're supposed to be. I went a little bit of a tangent. So, Gilded Age, 1890 to 1900. Again, it's more very pro-business. There is some regulation, again, like the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, but not a ton of effective regulation. Where the big moments, though, you get the creation of a third party in the 1890s. The Populist Party. They're a third party. And remember, if I say third parties, you say new idea, split the vote. And the Populists, they're farmers. They've come from a long range of politically active farmers. The Greenback Party in the 1860s and 70s. The Granger movement in the 1860s and 70s. And they're a third party who wants reforms. They will never win a presidential election. They'll win some governor's offices. They'll get some state offices. And they will be successful because a lot of their ideas will kind of morph into the progressive era. Initiative. In many states, they have a law that says if enough people sign a petition, you can compel the state government to act. Referendum. The idea that in many states, they will take controversial issues, like legalization of marijuana, gay marriage, stuff like that, and they will put it up to a vote. Heck, in our school districts every year, we have a budget referendum. Okay? Populist, People's Party. They want people to have more say. I don't know if you guys remember the story I told you about the recall, how the populists had this idea that, look, you should be able to vote a politician out of office early, even if he didn't break the law, but just because he's ineffective. I told you the story with California in 2003 and how they got the governor. Okay? Their big moment, the populists, in 1896 is they run William Jennings Bryan as their candidate. He's also the candidate for the Democrats, and Bryan gets his butt whooped. He gets annihilated by William McKinley, the hand-picked presidential candidate of big business. Now, when we talk about that 1896 election, remember, we also reference this idea of The Wizard of Oz, how that book was written kind of like as a symbolism of that 1896 election. When McKinley goes and gets assassinated at the World's Fair in Buffalo, New York in 1901, everything changes because the guy they buried as vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, was now El Presidente. And he's going to launch his square deal. Remember, we had 4 parts of the square deal. Trust busting. But you're not going to write that. You're going to say, although Teddy's known as a trust buster, in reality, he's a trust regulator. He differentiated between good trusts and bad trusts. You're going to tell me he used the Sherman Antitrust Act to prosecute over 40 trusts and break them up, including he's the guy who took down J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Railroad Company. And he's the guy who launched the investigation of The Rock and Standard Oil. Workers' rights. Go back, look at your notes for the anthracite coal miner strike that Teddy helped to mediate an end to. Consumer protection. After Upton Sinclair, famous muckraker, and by the way, if I say muckrakers, you say digging up the dirt. Sinclair wrote The Jungle, and Teddy and Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Now, that book and those 2 laws were all done in 1906. In fact, you really want to make a nice point for your essays. Guys, Teddy is the one who named the muckrakers. He compared them to a character in a children's story called Pilgrim's Progress. He listened to them, but he was like, you guys are a little bit too negative. You only focus on the bad stuff. But he did listen. Okay, so under Teddy, we're going to see a change in things. And the other big change, of course, is conservation. Teddy was heavily influenced by people like John Muir and Gifford Pinchot. Now, Muir was what we'd call a preservationist. His idea was that you have to preserve nature and leave it alone perfectly. Teddy was a little bit more of what historians like to say of a pragmatist. Look, we've got to protect certain areas. We've got to enjoy our natural resources, but we have to make sure that we conserve them for future generations. And Teddy's right-hand man with the plan was a guy named Gifford Pinchot. I told you the story about Pelican Island, girls, hats with the feathers, how that was the first piece of real estate that Teddy reserved. The creation of national parks, national forests, national wildlife preserves. How he put Pinchot in charge of managing this land with what we call the New Lands Reclamation Act. He also used the Antiquities Act. Teddy made the big mistake, remember, in 1904 of getting elected to his own term and saying, I consider this my second term, I won't run again. And he was going to regret that. Now, understand, before we move on to presidents after Teddy, it's not just presidents. We have a lot of progressive governors. Teddy in New York in 1898, Woodrow Wilson in 1910 in New Jersey, and Bob La Follette in his Wisconsin idea. Look that up in your free time, okay? The Wisconsin idea. And they have to do something, because there are people who are not necessarily elected officials who are pushing for reforms. Socialists like Eugene Debs. Pardon me. Socialists like Eugene Debs. There are people who are fighting for women's suffrage like Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. There are people who are looking to just change the way we do things economically and as a society. There's a guy named Frederick Taylor. He's the father of what we call scientific management. I told you the story about the guy with the stopwatch. The idea in progressive times was you could use science. You could use statistics to try to improve society. This will lead to some great reforms in cities. City governments get cleaned up, fighting corruption against the political machines. In fact, do-gooders who were trying to reform city politics were actually called goo-goos. I don't know who named them. It is what it is. During the progressive era, you get the creation of the city commissioner plan. The idea that, you put somebody in charge of a department, a police commissioner, a fire commissioner, a sanitation commissioner. Some cities, the mayor shares power, or he or she's like a figurehead, because some cities are run by a city manager. Again, progressive ideas. Other progressive ideas, not so good. False use of science for racist purposes. This year we talked about the eugenics movement, the idea of like racial superiority. We said the worst example of that was how in the early 1900s, California forced sterilization of thousands of people for mental illness, for learning disabilities, for committing crimes. The progressive era has its good and its bad. Certainly, it falls short in some areas. There were reform movements attempting to help families. Jane Addams and Hull House in cities like Chicago. That's where Hull House was. She ran a mansion that was a welfare center, a kindergarten, medical care, you name it, kind of social services, because there weren't social services in the cities. Child labor, attempts at it, the Keating-Owen Act, which was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. There were several Supreme Court cases dealing with labor. A couple that'll pop up on the AP test. Lochner versus New York. The question of, could the state of New York set maximum work week hours for bakery workers? Court said, no, you're depriving workers of their right to negotiate their own contracts. And then in a rare display of sexism, Mueller versus Oregon, where this time the Supreme Court said, hey, Oregon, yeah, you can limit the hours of women because they're women that need protection. I didn't say that. Not me. Supreme Court. Don't get mad. Yeah, you, Marissa, don't get mad. All right. So anyway, the big shortcoming we see in the progressive era, the one that you really have to own as a country, is in civil rights. There are some very prominent, intelligent, thoughtful African-American civil rights leaders. And they have the same goal, helping the lives of African-Americans fight for equal rights. They just do it in different ways. And it comes from their backgrounds. Booker T. Washington, who grew up in the sharecropping South with this idea of learning vocational training, gradualism. If blacks learn a trade, they will be able to get political equality later on. First, get economic equality. Washington eventually founds what's called the Tuskegee Institute. W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of the NAACP, talked about educating the, quote, talented 10th. Was more in favor of using boycotts, protests, courts to try to fight for civil rights. Really a rough time, though. Again, this is the height of the Jim Crow South. There's lynchings. We talked about how Teddy Roosevelt caused a national storm because he invited Booker T. Washington to lunch at the White House. A good symbol, a bad symbol of the progressive era racial issues was D.W. Griffith's silent film, The Birth of a Nation, a film where the KKK is effectively the Avengers. And, African Americans and the Union Army and the Republicans are the bad guys. It's a film that President Woodrow Wilson praised just to show you how rough civil rights were during that time period. So now, Teddy leaves office. He kind of helps support his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. Taft does some progressive things. He actually breaks up way more trust than Teddy, but Taft is more conservative than Teddy is. And, got a first question here. Were more African Americans supportive of Washington's approach or Du Bois' approach to civil rights? And Zach, here's what I'm going to say to you. It depends on where you're from. Again, think contextualization. Booker T. Washington's message is crafted from a person who lived and grew up in the South, where you're still in sharecropping, tenant farming times. You're still dealing with Jim Crow very directly. So, whereas Du Bois comes from up in New England, I think he was in Boston, and it depends. Certainly, at least in this case, Washington, in terms of like what white perception would be, Washington's approach was something that was more popular there. Taft takes over. He does progressive stuff. He busts trusts, but he's also really more conservative. He allows a lot of the land that Teddy had reserved to be sold back to private businesses. There's a dispute between Gifford Pinchot and the Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Ballinger. And when Pinchot criticizes Ballinger and Taft, Taft fires him. Taft was elected in 1908 promising not to raise the tariff. He got bullied by the Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, and ended up raising tariffs. Again, you can go way forward in time to 1988 to George Herbert Walker Bush when he gave the famous speech, "Read my lips, no new taxes." Both Papa Bush and Taft, one-term presidents. And what this is going to lead to is Teddy, after he comes back from his big game safari in Africa and all of his other excellent adventures, it's going to lead to Teddy coming back and running for president. He tries to get the Republican Party nomination and doesn't. So instead, the very progressive Republicans go out and they form their own political party with Teddy as their leader. They basically make a party for him called the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party. They're a third party. Again, new ideas split the vote. They bring up new ideas. Teddy's platform that he announces in Osawatomie, Kansas, the same place John Brown had given a speech, Teddy announces his new nationalism. Again, third parties, they bring up ideas that are crazy, like no child labor, a minimum wage, women's suffrage, a form of social security, campaign finance limitations. Boy, do we need that today. And Teddy and Taft end up spending this entire 1912 campaign fighting like King Kong and Godzilla. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic candidate, he runs on what's called the New Freedom. According to Wilson, there is a, quote, triple wall of privilege, 3 things that hurt the average person. And he's a good guy to know, not just for AP, but for the regions. According to Wilson, you got to fight high tariffs. So when he does become president, Congress passes what's called the Underwood Tariff. They drop tariff rates down. Trusts. Now, this is the big difference. Teddy was, are you a good trust or a bad trust? Wilson is, trust or bad, okay. So Wilson doesn't differentiate, and this Clayton Antitrust Act basically replaces the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it's hardcore. But the big domestic accomplishment of Woodrow Wilson was the Federal Reserve System, the government agency that regulates our money supply, that regulates our banking system, and that's his legacy. We still have the Fed today. Heck, the Fed's lowered interest rates to try to stave off an economic issue here. That reminds me, I got to see if I can refinance my mortgage. Okay. Wilson actually said, I I hope that I'm known as a domestic policy president. Well, it's not going to happen. So in 1912, Wilson wins. Teddy comes in second. Taft, the incumbent president, comes in third. Teddy is done in by the fact that, one, he divided up the vote with Taft. Two, the solid South. How the South had basically solidly united behind the Democratic Party because of some old grudges dealing with the Civil War and Reconstruction. Now, Wilson comes in, and in 1916, Wilson, who had promised to be a one-term president, changes his mind, and his campaign slogan in 16 was, "He kept us out of war." World War I had started in Europe in 1914, and Woodrow Wilson evokes George Washington. Again, guys, I'm so feeling it. They're going to ask you for connections. That whole idea of Washington and neutrality is something that you have to know, because you're either giving examples later in history of how we do it, or giving non-examples saying, no, look, here's how we got involved. In this case, we try to stay neutral. What draws us in? Well, American business interests. We do have a lot of loans, a lot of credit. We're doing a lot of business with the Allies. The use of unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans. The sinking of the British ship Lusitania. Over 1,000 people died and 126 Americans died. By the way, the sister ship of the Lusitania, both ships owned by the White Star Line, was the Titanic. I'd hate to have stock in the White Star Line. The Sussex Pledge. The British sink another ship, and this time they promise, okay, we'll back up. The Germans, they sink the Sussex, and this time they promise, look, we'll back off of unrestricted submarine warfare. When they go back on that promise, it pushes us towards war. The Zimmerman Telegram, where Germany tries to cut a deal with Mexico to say to Mexico, look, get involved in the war. You attack the U.S., we'll help you get back lost territories. We go to war. You don't need to worry about trench warfare and stuff like that. The bigger impact is America at home. Holy current events, there's a pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918. So you can make Faith, I will get to your top 5 essay prompts if I don't do it in a couple minutes. Shoot me another reminder. Again, this is all speculation because I don't know if we're going to have essays or we're going to have short answers, but there are certain topics that I'll be vague that AP, you're always going to see something of. They're going to have to. Because remember, you guys think you're scrambling. They're trying to redo a gosh darn test. So anyway, when we talk about World War I, one, economic mobilization of the U.S., the government goes full-fledged, hands-on, even more than before. Not in the progressive reform way. Antitrust legislation kind of disappears. But the government almost takes over. We have the War Industries Board, which tells factories, this is what you're going to produce. The Fuel Administration, which rations out and conserves coal and other types of fuel. Daylight savings. The government adopts daylight savings to regulate daylight and to also, conserve fuel. The Food Administration, which was designed to ration out food. There's a poem, I can't remember if it's World War I or World War II, but it went like this. My Mondays are meatless. My Wednesdays are wheatless. I'm growing more eatless each day. Okay. Jordan Willow asked, is there a possibility that the AP test would go back as originally planned? Nah, cat's out of the bag, Jordan. So on April 3rd, they'll tell us what they're going to do. It is going to be electronic testing, something that you can do one-on-one. They will do all the particulars. Again, we're not going to worry about like ifs and buts and stuff like that. Okay? So we see that. The hero in World War II is Herbert Hoover, who not only makes sure Americans have food, but he makes sure that people in Europe have food. We also see the government getting very involved in our civil liberties. When Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war on April 2nd, 1917, he said, quote, the world must be made safe for democracy. But Wilson did a lot of non-democratic things. First of all, as president, he was very anti-women's suffrage. Secondly, he ordered the segregation of the executive branch of the U.S. government. Again, the guy praised birth of a nation. During the war, out of necessity, but you could certainly argue not really democratic, Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1917, the draft. And yes, Eric Callahan, I do miss you guys, all of you guys. I'm a teacher because I want to be hanging out with you guys, not getting carpal tunnel syndrome trying to type stuff for you guys. And you guys know how I am with technology, okay? Monkey with a Rubik's Cube. Congress does more, though, and the president does more to restrict our civil liberties. The Espionage Act of 1917, which made it illegal to interfere with the war effort or the draft. The Sedition Act of 1918, which made it illegal to criticize the government or the war effort. Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for violating the Sedition Act. He didn't get out until the 1920s under President Harding. They commuted the rest of his sentence. And of course, the Supreme Court case of Schenck versus the U.S. And if I say Schenck versus the U.S., you say clear and present danger. Schenck was a socialist. He printed out pamphlets saying, look, don't register for the draft. If you get drafted, don't report. He was arrested for violating the Espionage Act. And he appealed saying, look, I've got First Amendment rights. And the Supreme Court said, yes, Schenck, you're right. But your freedom of speech can be limited if it represents a clear and present danger. Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes even went so far as to make an analogy. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Okay? We see lots of xenophobia, fear of foreigners, and nativism during World War I, particularly directed against German Americans. We talked about, words like hamburger became liberty steak or liberty sandwich. Sauerkraut became liberty cabbage. You had a case of the liberty measles, not the German measles. German composers were no longer allowed to be played. Prior to World War I, the German language was the most taught foreign language in American schools. Not anymore. There were some worse cases. German Americans being threatened with lynching, being threatened with mob violence if they didn't kiss the flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance. At the end of World War I, we're going to see increased nativism in the 1920s and America's first Red Scare, or fear of communist takeover and infiltration. Now, after World War I, people had shortages of goods. The government was incredibly hands-on. And in 1920, Warren Harding was elected, promising his return to normalcy. Again, according to Harding, isolation, laissez-faire, that's normal America. Getting involved in foreign affairs like Teddy and Wilson and all this progressive nonsense, that's not normal America. Harding's not going to be around for long. He dies in 1923. And when he does die, scandals come out like Teapot Dome. And Harding's administration, at least his name kind of afterward, kind of becomes like a joke. If you see Harding very often on like a Regents or an AP test question, they might lump him together with Ulysses Grant or Richard Nixon, the idea of scandals. And he's replaced by Calvin Coolidge. If you ever wanted a pro-business president, if you ever wanted the opposite of Teddy Roosevelt, it's Calvin Coolidge, whose two famous quotes were, well, the big one, the business of America is business, and the man who builds a factory builds a temple. He who comes to work comes to worship. While Coolidge is president, he practiced what we call trickle-down economics. Cut taxes for the wealthy and corporations with the idea that they will spend and invest that money and it will trickle down to middle class and then working class people. Lots of deregulation of American businesses. Coolidge twice vetoes bills that would have helped U.S. farmers. Remember, the Great Depression starts with farmers in the 1920s. It doesn't start in 1929. Okay? Now, in addition, we see pro-business high tariffs. You get the Fordney-McCumber tariff under Coolidge. And this is all going to cause a problem. There's going to be a ripple effect. You guys learned in global studies a word called interdependence. Something happens in one part of the world, it affects the rest of the world. And this is what happens. Europe is still reeling from World War I. Germany can't pay off its reparations to the Allies. The Allies can't pay off their loans to us. So we actually try a couple things. In 1924, there's this banker named Dawes, and we get what's called the Dawes Plan. Don't confuse that with the Dawes Severalty Act. That's the assimilation of Native American Indians in 1887. The Dawes Plan basically went like this. We will loan a couple $1 billion to Germany. Germany will then pay back Britain and France, so Britain and France can pay us back. Oh, yeah, by the way, now we're going to have a high tariff on European goods. You guys can't make enough money, and it's going to hurt foreign trade, which means you can't buy our goods, which means that depression's coming. Wall Street, people are playing fast and loose. People thought the stock market was your way to get rich quick, and they practice what we call stock market speculation, gambling on stocks. And I'm going to start moving inside because, believe it or not, there's mosquitoes. What in the world? Okay, so we get stock market speculation, the idea that I'm going to find a stock, I'm going to buy it when it's low, I'm going to sell it when it's high. We are also going to get the practice of buying on margin, where you put as little as 10% down to purchase a stock. We see practices like insider trading, dishonest business practices, and this will all set us up for that stock market crash, Black Thursday and Black Tuesday, 1929. But it's more than just the stock market crash, remember. There are other causes. The two biggest causes of the Great Depression: easy credit, again, the installment plan, buying on margin, and overproduction by factories and farmers. They haven't switched back from the wartime economy in the U.S. where you had to make everything to, there's only so many pairs of shoes and other consumer goods you can have. And the 1920s were all about consumer goods, this idea of consumerism. There's a great word for AP called conspicuous consumption. The idea that I need to show off how much I can buy, that my wealth, my possessions are my sign of prosperity. The idea of keeping up with the Joneses. We have to, the new neighbors, they have a new car. We have to get a new car. The neighbors, they've got new furniture. We have to get new furniture. Materialism. And that's what led to, the Depression, excessive buying on credit. And because of this overproduction, American companies, they were willing to give that credit. They were spending lots of money on advertisements. New forms of mass media encouraged consumerism. The radio. This is where you had the first celebrity endorsers. Babe Ruth, we mentioned, was one of the first big celebrity endorsers. So the Great Depression hits. And it hits early in the Hoover administration. Hoover is still clinging to the old model of rugged individualism. The idea that you got to let a man stand on his own. And Hoover tried to point out that, look, we have a business cycle, that we get periods of expansion peaks, we get recessions, we get depressions, that will come out of this. But Hoover underestimated how severe the Great Depression was. It's not that he didn't do anything. He just put a Band-Aid on a shark bite. He created what was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided emergency loans for banks, insurance companies, and railroads. Kind of like a big business bailout to try to save people's jobs in the economy. But Hoover was against giving direct relief. This idea of rugged individualism is that if you give people direct relief, they'll become dependent upon it. Hoover also believed in this thing called voluntarism. That throughout American history, when times are rough, the churches, the charities, you'd step up, you'd help your neighbor out. Again, Band-Aid on a shark bite. People began to associate Hoover with being heartless. People would turn their pockets inside out and call them Hoover flags. If you lived in a shack made out of cardboard or wood or scrap metal, it was a Hoover hotel. A bunch of those were called Hoovervilles. If you stuffed newspapers in your clothes to keep you warm at night, that's a Hoover blanket. And Hoover's big mistake, and again, this is all economically related, was the bonus army, or the bonus expeditionary force. World War I veterans who had been promised a bonus in 1945 for their service to their country were now banging on the door of the Capitol of Congress, protesting, saying, give us our bonus now. We can save our homes and, we can still have something. Well, Congress said no. And Hoover said, look, you got to go. And Hoover decided to kill a mosquito with a sledgehammer. He sent the army in, led by General Douglas MacArthur. And MacArthur was just supposed to get them out. He exceeded his authority, and he sent in flamethrowers, tanks. And when FDR heard about this was in the late summer of 1932, his quote was, "This elects me." Now we get the big change. We get the New Deal. Again, FDR made two promises to get elected. A repeal prohibition. Why? It's jobs. Someone's got to make beer. Someone's got to deliver it. And it's tax revenue. FDR and Congress will pass the Beer and Wine Act. Tax that. Now, and a New Deal for the American people. FDR, in that lame duck period, remember, from election day until he took office, he got the Brain Trust together in New York, and they brainstormed out all kinds of New Deal programs. And in his first 100 days, FDR and the Democratic-controlled Congress, they passed more legislation than it normally takes about 2.5 years to do. And if I say New Deal, you say relief, recovery, reform, New Deal, right? Look at New Deal relief programs, the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which provided direct relief to the American people, unlike Hoover. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, give young men ages 18 to like 25 or so conservation jobs, digging ditches, draining swamps. Green Lake State Park in New York, that's a CCC gig. The bank holiday, shutting all the banks down and saying they won't reopen until they're inspected by the government. That's some psychological relief. The HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which would insure people's mortgages so that more people wouldn't lose their homes. Recovery, the AAA, which kind of does both relief and recovery, really. It's going to pay farmers not to grow crops. So that's going to be a recovery effort to try to fix the whole overproduction thing and get prices back up. But in the meanwhile, look, here, you get money. Other recovery programs, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which regulated businesses, the Blue Eagle. That was the sign you put up if you were complying with NRA codes. The PWA and the WPA, the idea of building stuff, construction projects, but also funding for the arts and music and writers and stuff like that. Building schools. We talked about where Kinney Street Elementary was. Now that's ESC, but Kinney Street Elementary in East Syracuse was a WPA project. Now, reform, Social Security. Make sure that in the future, people who are elderly have a pension. Now, this was not FDR's idea. There's a guy named Francis Townsend who pushes this idea. He's a California physician, says, look, you put a 2% tax on people's payroll, and you can have a $200 a month guaranteed pension for the elderly. Now, of course, today, as a result of that baby boom, so you look again, we're connecting time periods. One of the big issues we have today is, can Social Security stay solvent? We have so many people of Social Security age, and there's more coming. And hey, great news, they're living longer. That's awesome. But Social Security was designed back at a time when, it was for your last couple golden years. Okay. Other New Deal reform programs, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to insure your bank deposits in case the bank went out of business. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, to regulate the stock market. Ultimately, the New Deal is going to come to an end, depending upon who you speak to, 1938-ish. A couple things happen. One, FDR attempts to balance the federal budget. If you remember, his economic plan was based upon this idea of Keynesian economics, or deficit spending, or pump priming. The idea that it's okay to go into debt. When FDR tries to balance the budget, we weren't ready for it yet, and we actually go into a recession. But his big mistake was court packing. FDR tried to add 6 judges to the Supreme Court at once. He literally wanted to change the structure of the court. See, there is no defined number of Supreme Court justices. 9 has kind of become the established number. The original Supreme Court had a Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. There have been Supreme Court cases that had 8 justice rulings because they had an opening. But when FDR says, look, I want to appoint 1 new judge for every guy over the age of 70, translated, I want to add a new Democrat/liberal judge for every conservative on the court. He's now trying to stack it so he's going to win 9-6 in decisions. And do your contextualization. This is a time in the 1930s of fascism, of totalitarianism, and even the Democrats in Congress go, whoa, hold on. The court packing plan gets rejected, and that becomes another factor in ending the New Deal. Lastly, if we're talking about period 7, we see big changes in civil rights. Okay. During the Gilded Age and the imperialism era, again, Faith, I'm doing this, and then I'm doing essay prompts. During the Gilded Age, we get the idea of still a segregated South, the solid South, where the Democrats solidly control it, sharecropping, tenant farming, Jim Crow laws. And we will see segregation and racism and lynching and a lack of civil rights throughout. Even under presidents like Teddy and FDR, who you would think of as a very progressive or very change-oriented presidents, there were New Deal programs that didn't allow African Americans. African Americans were not allowed to work on Boulder Dam, which was a big New Deal construction project. African Americans, I'm sorry, that was a Herbert Hoover construction project. African Americans had segregated CCC camps, didn't have as many opportunities. Eleanor Roosevelt really did do a lot, at least to push FDR. Go back and read about Marian Anderson. She was an African-American opera singer, and when the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow her to put a concert on in their hall, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from the organization and let Marian Anderson put a concert on at the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, but we will see that throughout. We also see nativism, whether it's Japanese Americans internment during World War II, German Americans with goofy things like Liberty sandwiches and Liberty cabbage in World War I, to the really oppressive nativism and xenophobia of the 1920s. Remember the 20s, the KKK comes back. It's their big resurgence because now they don't just hate African Americans, they hate Jews, Catholics, and immigrants. They hate people who are against prohibition. We see restrictive immigration laws, the quotas of 1921 and 1924, the National Origins Act. I got distracted by James playing with his trucks there. The National Origins Act in the 1920s, the Sacco and Vanzetti court case. We will see that throughout. All right, so before we get to essay or short answer or whatever we're going to call them prompts, again, this is all speculation and guess. It's just based upon my years doing this. Before we do that, happy birthday to Nolan Palmer, and a 1 and a 2 and a happy birthday. Nah, you don't want to hear me say. Okay. But James is singing to you, Nolan. All right. So whether we want to call them essays, short answers, you want to call them free response questions, Faith, there are certain big ones. If they give you choices, again, I don't know what the heck this test is going to look like. But over the years, the big popular things, there will be something about underrepresented groups in some way, shape, or form. Who are underrepresented groups? Women, workers, Indians, immigrants, African Americans. Think about your bagpipe chirps you guys do. I in identity. Identify a group of people. What rights they have, what rights they don't, who's hurting those rights, what they're doing to fight for their rights, is anyone helping them, and how successful are they? That is a topic. You can run that theme through all 7 time periods that they're going to test you on. Okay? You're going to, if I have to guess, foreign policy. That's always a big one. I don't care what it is. Somehow you sneak in a reference to George Washington's Proclamation of Neutrality, which was in the 1790s, this idea of neutrality, because any foreign policy from periods 3 through 7 is somehow going to fit in with this idea of America was neutral or America was getting involved in foreign affairs. Neutral. Jefferson with the War of 1812, before the War of 1812, the embargo of 1807. John Quincy Adams in the Quasi-War. Wilson before World War I, the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, or not being neutral. Polk, Manifest Destiny in the Mexican War. McKinley and the Spanish-American War, and Teddy Roosevelt and the other jingoists. Contrast, not getting involved in the League of Nations with the United Nations. Economic policy is another big one. Again, this whole idea of what's the role of the government. They love the Gilded Age, period 6, guys. We'll do a big deal with the Gilded Age. This question of laissez-faire, or is it kind of like a government that's pro-business? And then, of course, you have to contrast that. You have to have efforts to regulate businesses. The Square Deal, the New Deal. We could even go into the 1960s with the Great Society. What role should government be in the economy? Hands off, hands on. Immigration and what America's views towards immigration have been. They really have loved that. There have been entire DBQs about immigration. Very, very open immigration in the Gilded Age, except for the Chinese Exclusion Act, to starting to see restrictions during the Progressive Era, the eugenics movement, post-World War I, the Red Scare, the quotas, and the National Origins Act in the 1920s, xenophobia in World War I against Germans and World War II against Japanese Americans. Okay. They might do some comparison. Compare the First Great Awakening to the Second Great Awakening. And then again, we can look at the impact of religion as a reform movement, because we see that with the Progressive Era. One of the big influences on the Progressive Era was what was called the social gospel movement. The Salvation Army, the YMCA, Hull House, the idea of settlement house workers, all with kind of like a religious tie-in. We could get something about sectionalism and slavery in the Civil War. So again, it's a lot of speculation. Okay, guys, you've been great. Listen, before I go, other questions? This is your show. I'm going to try to do this. Hopefully you like it. Hey, listen, if you're listening and you like it, give me like a little thumbs up emoji or keep doing it, Ash, or something. I'm trying like heck to find any way I can to help you. Please blow up my email with questions. Hit me up on Google Hangouts because that gosh darn Chromebook is glued to me. Again, you're going to get the mother of all period 7 review packets. It's not an assignment. There's nothing for you to have to do, but I'm going to put this together for you so that you can go, wait, I don't know what this is. Oh, I'll click on this link. I've got images, videos, primary sources. I'm trying to make it's big, okay? But it's not like you have an assignment to do. Here's what I'm going to do. I am going to give you a multiple choice test wizard, and it'll be our last multiple choice because they're not going to do that in the AP test. But my thinking is, I always promise you two tests, a marking period, with the idea that I'll drop the lowest one. So, I thought maybe you might like that. And if I do it off a test wizard, that would give you a chance to bury that grade we don't want to talk about. And then really after that, guys, the only assessments you're going to get, I can't see them giving you a DBQ unless they give you like a mini one. And again, they'll tell us on April 3rd. But we're going to hammer out SAQs. We'll do some LEQs where I'll have you bullet them. Don't worry. Maybe like a mini DBQ where you bullet it. Okay, but we're going to do that. We also do have to do some new stuff because until that, New York State government makes their mind up with what we're doing, I got to assume we're going to end up having to keep teaching for the regions, but that'll be all regions type stuff, not AP stuff. So hit me up, email me. I miss you guys. I love teaching you. And if you have anything, you need anything, please give me a shout. Until then, log off and plug in your Chromies, homies. I'll see you soon.